December 18, 1944. The Ardennes Forest is frozen solid. Snow buries the roads. American infantrymen dig into shallow foxholes, their rifles stiff with ice, their breath hanging in the air. For many of them, this was supposed to be the quiet part of the war. Instead, German tanks are moving through the mist. The largest American defeat of the European war is beginning to unfold. Hundreds of miles away in Washington, telephones do not stop ringing. Reports speak of shattered divisions, broken lines, and an enemy striking with a violence few believed possible this late in the war. The United States Army, now the largest fighting force in the world, is suddenly under threat. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill reads the same cables, but what alarms him is not only the German advance. It is the response inside the Allied command. Two generals, two methods, two egos, one American, one British, both essential, both unwilling to bend. If they fail to work together, the cost will not be political embarrassment. It will be American lives trapped in the snow. And the decisions made in the next few days will push Churchill closer to the edge than at any other moment of the war. Because the danger no longer comes only from the enemy ahead, but from the alliance itself, stretched to its breaking point, as the situation demands context. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be entering its final phase. American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and driven German armies eastward at a pace few planners had predicted. For the United States, this was the moment when industrial power, manpower, and modern doctrine seemed fully vindicated. The U.S. Army was no longer learning on the job. It was leading the advance. At the center of that momentum stood General George S. Patton. His Third Army raced across France in August and September, advancing hundreds of miles in weeks. Towns fell in rapid succession. German resistance collapsed in many sectors before it could even organize. To American soldiers and the public at home, Patton embodied speed, aggression, and confidence. He represented the belief that pressure, applied relentlessly, could end the war sooner and spare lives in the long run. But success created new problems. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement troops struggled to keep up with the advance. Eisenhower, responsible for the entire Allied front, was forced to slow operations and redistribute resources. Priorities shifted north, toward Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's sector in Belgium and the Netherlands, where British forces aimed to break into Germany through a narrow corridor. Montgomery's approach could not have been more different from Patton: methodical, deliberate, carefully planned. Where Patton trusted momentum, Montgomery trusted preparation. Where Patton accepted risk, Montgomery minimized it. Both men believed deeply that their method was the correct one, and that the other's was dangerously flawed. Above them stood Winston Churchill. Britain's Prime Minister no longer commanded armies, but he understood something both generals often ignored. This war could not be won by brilliance alone. It could only be won if the alliance held together. As autumn faded into winter, the front line stretched thin across forests and hills thought unsuitable for major attack. American units rotated into what was considered a quiet sector, the Ardennes. It was here, amid that false sense of security, that the fragile balance between Allied confidence and coordination began to crack, setting the stage for a far deeper crisis. By December 1944, Germany was losing the war, but not yet defeated. The Red Army pressed from the east. Allied bombers devastated German cities. Fuel reserves were collapsing. Yet Adolf Hitler believed a single, decisive blow in the West could still change everything. His plan was audacious and desperate. A surprise winter offensive through the Ardennes Forest, aimed at splitting American and British forces, capturing Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. The German High Command assembled what strength it had left. Elite panzer divisions were pulled from reserves. Fuel was hoarded for one final push. Secrecy was absolute. Allied intelligence, confident in German weakness, failed to detect the scale of the buildup. The Ardennes, defended largely by American divisions recovering from earlier fighting, appeared vulnerable. On December 16, German artillery shattered the quiet. Infantry and armor surged forward under heavy fog. Within hours, American lines buckled. Communications broke down. Entire units were cut off. For the United States Army, it was a shock unmatched since Kasserine Pass. The scale of the breakthrough stunned Allied headquarters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower now faced his greatest test as Supreme Allied Commander. He needed speed, coordination, and trust, especially between commanders who did not naturally cooperate. To stabilize the northern shoulder of the breakthrough, Eisenhower made a decision driven by necessity rather than harmony. American 1st and 9th Armies in the North were temporarily placed under Montgomery's operational control. Militarily, the choice made sense. Politically, it was explosive. In Washington, senior leaders bristled at the idea of American forces answering to a British field marshal. In the field, American generals worried their troops would be slowed at the moment they needed to move fastest. And in London, Winston Churchill understood exactly how fragile the situation had become. If the Germans succeeded, blame would spread fast. If the Allies argued in public, the consequences could be just as severe. By December 18, the scale of the crisis was unmistakable. German forces had punched a deep bulge into the Allied line. American divisions were scattered, some retreating, others surrounded. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was encircled, low on ammunition and medical supplies, holding a road junction that suddenly mattered more than any map predicted. Eisenhower understood that hesitation now would be fatal. Orders went out rapidly. In the North, Montgomery was told to stabilize the front, reorganize shattered units, and prevent a wider collapse. In the South, Patton received a different instruction, one that would test every assumption about modern warfare. Patton was ordered to turn his Third Army north. It was a maneuver few believed possible. His forces had been driving east, engaged against German units along the Saar. Roads were clogged. Winter storms grounded aircraft. Fuel was scarce. Yet within hours, Patton issued new orders. Divisions pivoted. Columns reversed direction. Entire corps began moving through snow and ice, often at night, guided by headlights taped to narrow slits. This was not improvisation. It was preparation meeting opportunity. Patton had anticipated the possibility of a German counterstroke weeks earlier. Staff plans were already drafted. When the order came, the machinery of movement began to grind forward almost immediately. As American armor pushed north toward Bastogne, tension grew at Allied headquarters. Montgomery slowed operations deliberately in his sector, focusing on restoring order before advancing. From his perspective, caution would prevent disaster. From Patton's, speed was the only answer. Between them stood Churchill, watching casualty figures climb, reading conflicting reports, and realizing that victory now depended not only on defeating the German attack, but on preventing the Allied command from tearing itself apart under the strain of winter, pressure, and pride, as the battle moved toward a moment that would force every man involved to answer for his choices. By December 22, the immediate military picture began to shift. Patton's forward units reached the outskirts of Bastogne, smashing through German roadblocks under heavy fire. Within days, the siege would be broken. For American soldiers inside the town, survival now felt possible. For Washington, the relief carried immense symbolic weight. The U.S. Army had bent, but it had not broken. But even as German momentum stalled, a new crisis ignited, this one entirely of Allied making. On December 23, Field Marshal Montgomery addressed the press. In carefully chosen language, he described the Northern battle as a situation he had restored after assuming control. The implication was unmistakable. British leadership had stabilized the front. American forces, by contrast, had been rescued. The reaction was immediate and furious. American commanders felt their troops' sacrifice had been minimized. Bradley was enraged. Patton, already hostile toward Montgomery, considered the remarks an insult to men who had fought and died in the snow. Messages flew to Eisenhower. Complaints reached Washington. Newspapers began framing the battle not as an Allied victory, but as a dispute over credit. Winston Churchill read the transcript with growing alarm. This was the very scenario he had feared since the first German shells fell. Public division, American resentment, British pride. At a moment when unity mattered more than at any point since Normandy, two of the alliance's most visible generals were now pulling in opposite directions. Churchill acted swiftly and privately. He pressured Montgomery to clarify his remarks and acknowledge the American role explicitly. He reassured Roosevelt that Britain did not seek credit at America's expense. He urged Eisenhower to keep the dispute from becoming public policy. Churchill was not angry because Patton attacked too aggressively or because Montgomery moved too cautiously. He was furious because both men, in their own way, had forgotten the larger war. The enemy was not each other. The enemy was still fighting. The German offensive would fail. Bastogne would hold. The Western Front would stabilize. But in that frozen week of December 1944, Churchill came closer than ever to losing control of the alliance he had spent 5 years building, because victory itself had sharpened rivalries instead of softening them, and the consequences would echo long after the guns fell silent. The German counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, ultimately failed. Patton's rapid northward advance relieved Bastogne on December 26, 1944. American units, exhausted and battered, began consolidating their lines, while German forces, running low on fuel and suffering severe casualties, were forced to retreat. By early January 1945, the front had largely returned to its original positions, marking a strategic victory for the Allies. But the military success only partially masked the tensions that had emerged behind the lines. Montgomery's press statements, portraying the stabilization of the northern sector as primarily his achievement, had inflamed American commanders. Letters and messages reached Eisenhower, expressing anger at the perceived minimization of U.S. sacrifices. Patton, already a polarizing figure, was incensed that the men of the Third Army, who had executed one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war, were being denied public recognition. Even within the British High Command, some officers worried Montgomery's statements had jeopardized Allied cohesion. Churchill's reaction was both political and personal. As Prime Minister, he had spent the previous 5 years cultivating a public image of Anglo-American solidarity. Now, the alliance's most visible generals were undermining that narrative. Private communications show Churchill pressed Montgomery to issue clarifications, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging the American role. Simultaneously, he reassured President Roosevelt that Britain's ultimate aim remained the defeat of Germany, not public acclaim. Churchill's fury at both Patton and Montgomery was tempered by his understanding of human nature. Leaders under pressure often acted out of ego, but he recognized that left unchecked, their rivalry could damage the alliance far more than any German counterattack. In Washington, the mood was tense. Roosevelt's advisors monitored troop reports and press coverage, anxious that public perception might frame the Bulge as a contest between commanders rather than a collective victory. Congressional correspondence reflected a desire for accountability, and some U.S. military leaders recommended stricter oversight of operations in the northern sector. Eisenhower, caught between personalities, had to balance military necessity with alliance diplomacy. His decisions over the following weeks, allowing Montgomery operational control temporarily while enabling Patton to continue his rapid offensive in the South, were crucial in maintaining both momentum against Germany and trust among Allied leaders. The immediate consequence was clear. The Americans felt slighted, the British felt justified, and Churchill felt trapped between them. Yet, by the end of December 1944, a fragile equilibrium had been restored. Patton's Third Army continued its northward advance, Montgomery maintained his methodical approach in Belgium, and Churchill had reasserted political control, keeping public perception and military strategy aligned. But the crisis had left an indelible mark on all parties involved. The weeks following the Bulge would be defined not only by further advances into Germany, but by lingering tension among commanders whose egos had nearly fractured the alliance at its most critical moment. The ripple effects of the December 1944 crisis extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. While Bastogne had been relieved and the German offensive halted, the dispute between Patton and Montgomery had fundamentally altered the dynamic of Allied leadership. Montgomery, despite his meticulous planning and northern successes, had lost credibility with many American generals. Eisenhower, tasked with maintaining unity, grew increasingly wary of Montgomery's tendency to seek public recognition. Letters from Bradley and other U.S. commanders emphasized that future coordination would require careful oversight to prevent unilateral claims of credit. Patton, meanwhile, had emerged as a hero in the eyes of the troops and the American public. His rapid maneuver to relieve Bastogne became legendary, reinforcing the perception of the U.S. Army's agility and determination. Yet his assertiveness, combined with a temperament prone to clashes with other leaders, meant that he remained politically sensitive. Patton's relationship with Montgomery, already tense, became almost irreparable. Although the men continued to operate under the broader Allied command structure, personal trust between them never fully recovered. For Churchill, the crisis underscored a recurring theme. Coalition warfare was not won merely through victories on the battlefield, but also through the management of egos, politics, and perception. Reports from his private secretaries and cabinet minutes reveal his frustration. He noted that the greatest danger sometimes comes from those within our own ranks. Churchill's intervention prevented a public rupture between British and American leadership. By compelling Montgomery to issue clarifications, reassuring Roosevelt, and privately counseling Eisenhower, Churchill averted what could have become a diplomatic and strategic disaster. His fury at both generals, fueled by the fear of losing control of the alliance, was tempered only by the immediate necessity of restoring unity. The consequences also reached American public opinion. Newspapers reported the heroism of the 101st Airborne and the relief at Bastogne, but coverage of Montgomery's statements created subtle tension over who had contributed most to the victory. In subsequent months, military historians would note the credit war, almost overshadowing the actual military success. Within the Allied headquarters, procedures were quietly adjusted. Commanders were reminded of the primacy of coalition cohesion, and briefings increasingly emphasized coordinated accomplishments rather than individual triumphs. Longer term, Patton's aggressive style continued to influence U.S. military doctrine, emphasizing speed, flexibility, and decisive action. Montgomery's caution, meanwhile, remained influential within British planning, but his public reputation suffered in American eyes. For Churchill, the episode was a stark reminder that even after years of war, leadership required constant vigilance. Maintaining trust, balancing personalities, and managing perception was as essential as defeating the enemy. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the lessons of December 1944 had already reshaped command relationships, ensuring that the alliance could survive not just the battlefield, but the human drama that raged behind it. Even as military operations continued toward final victory, the fragile balance of leadership, ego, and diplomacy that Churchill had preserved during the crisis would resonate through the closing months of the war, setting the stage for the reflections that would define its historical legacy. The Battle of the Bulge was, at its core, a test not only of military strategy but of human resolve. For the United States, it revealed the strength, flexibility, and determination of its soldiers and commanders. While Montgomery sought caution and Churchill worked tirelessly behind the scenes to preserve unity, it was the decisiveness and audacity of Patton and the American forces that ultimately turned the tide. The speed with which the Third Army maneuvered, the courage of men holding Bastogne under relentless fire, and the resilience of units stretched thin across a frozen forest demonstrated the uniquely American combination of initiative and adaptability in combat. Beyond the battlefield, the crisis underscored a larger truth. Victory in coalition warfare requires more than strategy. It demands trust, confidence, and the ability to act under pressure. The United States proved that it could not only respond to unforeseen emergencies, but also assert its leadership when stakes were highest. Patton's northward advance was a statement of operational genius. The bravery of U.S. troops reinforced that American initiative could decisively influence the outcome of critical moments, even under extreme conditions. For Churchill, the fury he felt toward Patton and Montgomery reflected the weight of responsibility. Yet the resolution of the crisis highlighted a subtle but powerful truth. America's contribution to the war had become indispensable. Without the speed, aggression, and resourcefulness of U.S. forces, the bulge might have turned into a catastrophe. The crisis revealed that while alliances are fragile, the United States possessed the resolve to lead when the moment demanded it. As winter gave way to spring, the lessons of December 1944 endured. Strategic decisions, leadership under pressure, and the courage of individual soldiers shaped not only the outcome of a single battle, but the trajectory of the war in Europe. The Americans who fought and the generals who acted decisively demonstrated that strength of character, initiative, and unwavering commitment to mission could overcome both enemy attacks and internal disputes. In the end, the story of Patton, Montgomery, and Churchill is not only a story of conflict. It is a story of American leadership proving itself under fire, ensuring that the largest army the world had ever seen could act with speed, precision, and courage, preserving both the alliance and the future of the free world.